Go out there and
Basically.
do it.
All right, let's touch on the next topic, the 90s versus the new era. This is always the big thing in every sports group, is how soft the new era is compared to the rough 90s era.
I mean, this topic is so annoying to me because I mean everything changes. Nothing's gonna stay the same. Every sport that we have here in America and even around the world is not the same as it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Nothing is gonna be the same. And for those individuals that want or clamor for it to stay the same, it's like what's the purpose of new players, new things happening if you want everything to stay how it was. And if you look back at basketball in the 90s, everyone's saying it's soft now because you know you can't foul and hold the way that they were holding in the 90s. Like they didn't, like now when you're playing defense, you actually have to have good technique. You have to
You have to
actually
pick up
use
people
your
from
feet.
half court.
Exactly. You got to pick up people, 94 feet sometimes because you got people like Steph Curry and Dame Lillard and Trey Young that shoot it from,
The
the
logo.
logo,
Yeah.
LeBron shooting it from the logo. So you have to use your feet. You have to use good technique because, you know, these guys are uber talented now. They're way more talented, way more athletic. You have better shooters now than you did in the 90s. Like you take, you, everybody always talks about, these players are soft and this and that. You take Zach Levine and you put him in the 90s, he's gonna dominate. He is gonna dominate because he's gonna be the most athletic person in the league, more athletic than Mike. Zach Levine would dominate in the
And
90s
probably one of
because
the
of
best shooters. Dude,
exactly like he has
he
everything
has
that
range. Yeah.
everything that no one else had back in the 90s. Like he has Mike's athleticism with the ability of Lamar Price. Like, you see what I'm saying? Then the ball handling skills now doesn't even you can't even name someone outside of Tim Hardaway or Mark Jackson that could handle the rock the same as Kyrie Irving. Like who back in the 90s could you say could handle the rock better than Kyrie Irving? Like it's crazy how people just focus on the fact that you could foul or you could fight back in the 90s, equate now, the current era of being soft. Is like, no, they put these rules in place to protect these,
To protect people.
the
Yeah, that's
new
why
era
no
because
one's
everyone's
playing that long.
run
Because they too busy.
running faster,
Yeah.
jumping higher. Like it's the same with NFL. Like you have way better now that's bigger, faster, stronger. So of course you need to protect your assets. You can't, back then, you had maybe 10 total people in the 90s that were super athletic, like Michael Jordan, Clyde Drexler. You know what I mean? You didn't have everyone in the league has a 40-inch vertical. Like it's, back then you had people that could barely jump over a piece of paper, but you want to call, now you want to call this era soft. Like you dropped LeBron, KD, Harden, Steph Curry, Anthony Davis, Giannis. You drop these dudes in the 90s, they are killing.
Yeah. Yeah, just like I was trying to say on the other show, let's settle it that if you put James Harden in the 90s, they didn't switch, they guarded people one on one, he would score 70 points a lot of times because you cannot guard James Harden one on one. I don't care who you are. They talking about, well, he went last. I was like, well, Kiki Vandeweghe averaged almost 30 points a game. He lasted in the 80s. So how James Harden's not going to last? Like, come on now. Come on
Yeah,
now.
he wouldn't last. Like why wouldn't he last? Like
I
James
mean,
Harden is not a
Dale
little
Ellis
dude.
was a shooter. Like, Dale Ellis was a shooter. He averaged over 25 points a game. So you mean to tell me James Harden couldn't double that one on one?
Right. And they forget James Harden is not a small guy. Like
The
he's
dude is
not
6'5",
uh,
230.
right. He's not right. He's not 150 pounds. Like you think he can't punish, going to the hole and punishing some of these guys. Like, yeah, of course, in the 90s, they had, some of the greatest centers to ever
Yeah.
play and big men to ever play the game. Like, yes, I
Like like
give the
like
'90s
like like
that.
the thing with that. Look at Kyrie Irving. There are 6, 8 to 7 footers everywhere. They can't block his shot. So what makes you think Patrick Ewing, who barely jumped, is going to block his shot?
And
Come
Kyrie
on now.
got one hell of a layup package too. Ooh, that boy's package is
Come on
ridiculous when
now.
it comes to layups, man.
Like if that was the
He,
case, Thomas wouldn't have scored so many points.
right. Yeah, that's true,
I mean,
man.
like he's
People,
just extra skilled.
it's the nostalgia, and people are stuck in stuck in that era. It's like me. I'm still stuck in the '90s era when it comes to music. Like I can admit that. Like I don't want to. It's newer individuals now that I listen to. When it comes to like J. Cole and Kendrick, Drake, Future. Sometimes those guys, but I'm not gonna indulge in the other guys. You know what I mean? It's certain individuals that I will indulge in when it comes to this new era, but I'm still stuck in that '90s era. But I do recognize the talent, how it's different when it comes to the NBA. People don't want to recognize the greatness of these new guys because they're still stuck on people getting knocked around and in the '90s elbows and the fights and all that ridiculousness when that's not something that's cost effective when it comes to the business model. You could potentially lose an asset because you guys want to keep this hard nose and knock people on their ass when they in the air and hard foul. You guys want to keep that alive, but then
And
you will be sad because now uh, Kevin Durant got knocked on his ass. Now he tore his ACL because he got knocked out of the sky, and now everyone is sad and upset. Or what I mean, it just doesn't make sense that people want it to be barbaric, but then at the same time, when something like the Malice in the Palace happens, now
yeah, they
they're a bunch
play.
of thugs and animals.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't make sense.
Man, they whole argument don't make sense because everything is centered around Jordan. That's the problem. Everything is centered around Jordan. Jordan played in this rough, tough era, and Jordan won this era. Like, no, they changed the rules so Jordan could win. Jordan was getting slammed, and they changed the rules that you can't do that no more.
Yeah.
So when Jordan was playing in the '90s, no one was fouling like that. No one was fighting. You could only think of one fight in the '90s, and that was Larry Johnson versus Alonzo Mourning
Yeah.
throwing air punches. Like, what fights did you see in the '90s?
No. And people really forgetting the fact that the ratings in the '90s was suffering because there was nothing marquee. Like, so
Just the
the
Bulls.
bird the bird and Magic
Yeah.
feud, that was gone, and then the bad boys, they were getting older and they were leaving, so they had to find something to latch on to, and Air Michael
And,
Jordan was it.
and it
Air
was
Michael
just the
Jordan was the
Bulls.
thing,
It was
and the
just the
Bulls.
Bulls. Only the
Exactly.
Bulls. Nothing
That was
else.
nothing else. That's all. That's where it was. Like, you had talent around. You had the Knicks and Patrick Ewing. You had Charles Barkley. You
And
had
nobody
Sean
watching.
Kemp and Gary Payton. You had those guys, but it was the Bulls because they had this figure that everyone saw. He had the shoes. He had the tongue. Aaron Michael Jordan. He was a beast. So it's like, okay, we found it. Now let's put the NBA on his shoulders and let's take it to where we can take it. And like you said, when the Pistons was whooping his ass, it was like, okay, it's time for something to
They
change,
changed
and
it. They
that's
changed
what
the
happened.
handshaking rules and everything. They made it easier for Jordan to not get beat up. And people
Yep.
just don't understand. Like when Shaq and Barkley talk about how their era was the best and this era they're terrible. I was like, do you remember the lower teams who could barely score 80 points a game? Like, not everyone was a championship team. Like, they got good teams and they had bad teams. That's always the case. The good teams won 50 to 60 games. Like the Sonics, they won like 60 plus games. In general, the Sonics were not that dominant of a team, but they had a lot lesser teams that they constantly beat up on. Like,
Yep.
remember when the Hawks won 60 games in like 2000, like 15 or something, 2000 and like 14. Anyways, but that's because the East had a lot of bad teams that they beat up on. That's why the Hawks won 60 games. That happened all of the 90's. And when they talk about Jordan beat all these 60-win teams in the in the playoffs, that's because there was a lot of bad teams. They wasn't the best teams. If there was 10 good teams, they wouldn't have won 60 games. Simple as that. The Bulls won 72 and 69 games back to back for a reason. Because the East was pathetic. There was like 3 good teams in the NBA, maybe 4. Like they were not out there winning versus all this talent. There was 1 All-Star per team, maybe 2. Besides the Bulls, they had like 3 Hall of Famers on their team. Other than that, like it was so spread out. And I was showing someone this interview of Dr. J and Larry Bird. They was talking about how the expansion era of the 90's watered down the teams, and Dr. J was talking about how in the 80's there was like so many good teams that the 90's just did not have. They only had the Bulls. So even like the greats of that era, like the era before, was saying the same thing about the 90's, and now the 90 players are saying the same thing about the players today. Like it's gonna always be different. Like at least now there's like 2 superstars on a lot of teams, but in the 90's there was literally 1, maybe 2 superstars per team, or all stars per team. It wasn't the superstars per team.
Right.
So yeah, they just misremembering everything about the 90's because Jordan played in the 90's, and it had to be the best.
Yeah.
It had to be the best. And they don't look at when he played in the 80's. Half his career was in the 80's. He didn't win a thing in the 80's for a reason.
Yeah, they
And
don't
the other
they
half,
don't want to admit that.
they want to take off certain years, like when he came back, the 80's. Then when he came back the second time, it was the third time almost. So they
Those
just want
count.
to
They
take
count.
off everything, but everything LeBron does, it gets added to his resume. Even his year where he was 18 years old, that gets added.
Mm-mm.
So, thanks for tuning into Not Another Sports Show on the Blue Chippers podcast. For more content, check out our other shows and subscribe to the Blue Chippers podcast on YouTube. Follow us on Not Another Sports Show 2021 on Instagram and Twitter.